Hello, I'm Professor Peraza, and today's lecture video covers the macronutrients. We will be discussing proteins. These are the specific learning objectives for this module. This module also meets the following course learning objectives. Protein is the third energy-yielding macronutrient we are going to cover. Protein has a lot of critical functions in the body, including immune system function, hair and nail growth, and digestion. Proteins are composed of amino acids that are linked together by peptide bonds. There are 20 different amino acids, 9 of which are essential and 11 which are non-essential. Essential amino acids are those that cannot be made by the body or cannot be synthesized because our cells cannot make the carbon skeleton, attach an amino group, or make them fast enough to meet our needs. The essential amino acids must come from food and include histidine, isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, tryptophan, and valine. There are 11 non-essential amino acids, which are those we can synthesize. These include alanine, arginine, asparagine, aspartic acid, cysteine, glutamic acid, glutamine, glycine, proline, serine, and tyrosine. These non-essential amino acids are still vital to protein synthesis and present in food. In addition, there's also what's called conditionally essential amino acids, which are not essential except during a time of stress or perhaps illness. In these cases, our body cannot synthesize enough of the non-essential amino acids and more are required. Examples include glutamine and arginine, which help to promote recovery from trauma and infection. Glutamine in particular is needed to make other amino acids as well as glucose. Research shows that L-glutamine supplementation results in faster recovery and reduces muscle soreness after exercise, especially eccentric. Arginine is found in meat, poultry, and fish and stimulates the release of growth hormone and insulin. Research shows that arginine can aid in wound healing. Another instance is when an amino acid becomes conditionally essential would be with phenylketonuria, or PKU. PKU is an inherited disorder caused by mutations in the PAH gene. The PAH gene is responsible for making the enzyme phenylalanine hydroxylase. This enzyme would convert the amino acid phenylalanine to tyrosine. Without this enzyme, phenylalanine can build up to harmful levels in the body, leading to brain damage. Phenylalanine is found in artificial sweeteners and proteins. As a result, tyrosine becomes conditionally essential. In discussing essential versus non-essential amino acids, I want to talk about complementary proteins. Proteins are classified as complete or incomplete. Complete proteins contain all of the essential amino acids, and incomplete are low in one of the essential amino acids. Animal proteins, with the exception of gelatin, are complete proteins, as well as quinoa and soy, like tofu, edamame, and tempeh. Most other plant proteins are considered incomplete. Complementary proteins are when you combine two incomplete proteins to compensate for deficiencies in essential amino acids. An example would be peanut butter and whole wheat bread or beans and rice. Now, with that said, our cells require a pool of essential amino acids for synthesis of proteins. It isn't necessary to worry about consuming complementary proteins at the same time. The emphasis is on getting a balance of protein and a variety throughout the whole day. Here are some examples of plant proteins: quinoa, oats, nutritional yeast, lentils, tempeh, seitan, and soy milk. We reviewed My Plate in the first lecture, so here are some examples of what 1 ounce equivalent looks like for plant proteins. A 1/4 cup cooked beans, tablespoon of peanut butter, a 1/4 cup or about 2 ounces of tofu, 1 ounce tempeh cooked, 6 tablespoons of hummus, 1/2 ounce of nuts or seeds, and 12 almonds, 24 pistachios, 7 walnut halves. Here are some examples of animal proteins. We have beef, goat, ham, lamb, pork, chicken, fish, eggs, and dairy products like milk. Let's review protein synthesis. I mentioned earlier that amino acids are linked together by peptide bonds, which are formed between the amino group and the acid group of amino acids. Protein synthesis is basically the process of creating protein molecules. There are dipeptides, which are 2 amino acids, tripeptides 3, oligopeptides 4 to 9, and polypeptides 10 or more. This process involves transcription and translation. Transcription is the transfer of genetic instructions in DNA to mRNA in the nucleus. This template is needed for the next step of translation. In translation, the amino acids are linked together in a particular order based on the genetic code. This occurs at the ribosome, which consists of rRNA and proteins. After a polypeptide chain is synthesized, it may undergo additional processing to form the finished protein. We discussed protein synthesis, and this is balanced with protein degradation. Protein turnover is important for our body and a normal process that allows for renewal or replacement of proteins. This balance allows for our cells to regulate function and also respond to cellular events. In an anabolic state, the rate of protein synthesis exceeds breakdown, and with a catabolic state, the rate of breakdown exceeds synthesis. Protein organization. Protein structure enables it to perform a variety of functions. There are 4 levels of protein structure: primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. The positioning of the amino acids is important for the amino acids to be able to interact and fold correctly into their intended shape. The primary structure is the simplest level of protein structure and just the sequence of amino acids in a polypeptide chain. This is one-dimensional. The secondary structure is the local folding or simple coils and sheets. This structure is determined by the chemical interactions between amino acids. The tertiary structure is the 3-dimensional shape that is formed as the different side chains of amino acids chemically interact, either repelling or attracting each other. With quaternary structure, 2 or more polypeptides are interacting together to form a larger new protein. An example of a protein with a quaternary structure is hemoglobin. It is composed of 4 polypeptides that bond together to form a functional oxygen carrier. A protein structure also influences its nutritional quality. Large fibrous protein structures are more difficult to digest than smaller proteins, and some, such as keratin, are indigestible. Because digestion of fibrous proteins is incomplete, not all amino acids are absorbed and available for the body to utilize, thereby decreasing their nutritional value. The 3-dimensional structure of a protein can be disrupted by changes in the environment, causing the protein to unfold or denature. This results in a loss of structure and function of the protein. The protein is basically turned back into its unstructured string of amino acids. A protein can be denatured due to heat or acid. The stomach secretes acids that kill pathogens and denature food proteins. Frying an egg is another example. The albumin protein in the egg white will become opaque and solid with heat and will not return to the raw egg state it was prior to cooking. Let's cover some of the crucial functions of proteins. Enzymes are proteins that conduct specific chemical reactions. An enzyme's job is to provide a site for a chemical reaction and to lower the amount of energy and time it takes for that chemical reaction to happen. This is known as a catalyst. Many neurotransmitters also are derivatives of amino acids. Dopamine, for example, is made up of tyrosine, norepinephrine of tyrosine, and serotonin, tryptophan. Proteins are also responsible for hormone synthesis. Hormones act as chemical messengers and also aid in regulatory functions. When an endocrine gland is stimulated, it releases a hormone which is then transported in the blood to its target cell, where it communicates a message to initiate a specific reaction or cellular process. Insulin, for example, is a hormone made up of many amino acids. It is released by the pancreas in response to an increase in blood glucose levels. A major function of hormones is to turn enzymes on and off, so some proteins can even regulate the actions of other proteins. While not all hormones are made from proteins, many of them are. Fluid balance is another key role of proteins. Proteins continuously circulate at high concentrations in your blood, which keep water distributed properly in different compartments of the body. One of these abundant proteins in the blood is albumin. Normal blood pressure in your arteries forces blood into the capillary beds. Blood fluid moves into the spaces between your nearby cells, called the interstitial spaces, and this provides nutrients to your cells. Albumin and other proteins in the blood act like sponges to keep fluid in your blood vessels. The presence of albumin attracts the right amount of fluid back into the blood, partially counteracting the force of blood pressure to maintain a fluid balance. If too much water suddenly moves from the blood into a tissue, the results are swelling and potentially cell death. Low albumin may contribute to edema, but it's not usually the only cause. Edema is when tissues swell with excessive fluid as fluid builds in the interstitial spaces. Edema is the medical term for swelling. Body parts can swell from injury or inflammation. Protein is also essential in maintaining proper pH balance, the measure of how acidic or basic a substance is in the blood. Blood pH is maintained between 7.35 and 7.45, which is slightly basic. Albumin also acts as a buffer against changes in concentrations of calcium, potassium, and magnesium, which balances blood pH and maintains homeostasis. Proteins also play vital roles in transporting substances around the body. For example, albumin chemically binds to hormones, fatty acids, and some vitamins, essential minerals, and drugs, and transports them throughout the circulatory system. Each red blood cell contains millions of hemoglobin molecules that bind oxygen in the lungs and transport it to all the tissues in the body. Protein also plays an important role in the immune system. Antibodies are protective proteins that bind to foreign antigens like viruses and toxins and remove them from your body. The antibodies secreted by white blood cells survey the entire circulatory system, looking for harmful bacteria and viruses to surround and destroy. If we don't have enough protein, our body's ability to fight infection is reduced as these antibodies cannot be formed. Our immune system would lack the material to build defenses for attack on our target cells. Lysosome, which is an enzyme, is secreted in saliva, and this is another example of protein playing a role in immune health. Lysosome attacks the walls of bacteria, causing them to rupture. Lastly, protein is used for energy production, though not the primary fuel source for our bodies. Only about 10% of dietary proteins are catabolized each day to make cellular energy. The liver is able to break down amino acids to the carbon skeletons, which can then be fed into the citric acid or Krebs cycle. Protein can be also utilized to synthesize glucose through gluconeogenesis if not enough carbohydrates are being consumed. If calorie intake is too low, this can be problematic as the synthesis of new proteins can be compromised and muscle proteins can be destroyed. Since there's no specialized storage system for proteins for energy, like carbohydrates and lipids, any extra protein would be stored as body fat. Let's review digestion and absorption for protein. In the mouth, food is broken into smaller pieces to be swallowed. We have the salivary glands secreting saliva. In the stomach, gastric juices are released, and these contain HCl and pepsin, which is an enzyme that starts the chemical digestion of protein. Peristalsis, which is the one-way contraction and relaxation, also occurs to aid in protein digestion. Proteins are denatured in the stomach from their three-dimensional structure. Once proteins are denatured in the stomach, the peptide bonds linking amino acids together are more accessible for enzymatic digestion. Once in the small intestine, secretin and CCK are released, which stimulate proteases to be released by the pancreas. This allows for proteins to be broken down into tripeptides, dipeptides, and individual amino acids. Tripeptides, dipeptides, and single amino acids enter the enterocytes of the small intestine using active transport systems which require ATP. The tri and dipeptides are broken down into single amino acids, which can then be absorbed into the bloodstream. From there, they are transported to the liver to be used for protein synthesis, energy, or converted to glucose or fats, and transported to other cells. Proteins that aren't fully digested in the small intestine pass into the large intestine and eventually excreted in the feces. Let's review protein recommendations. The AMDR for proteins is 10 to 35% of calories. The adult RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. Healthy weight is used as a baseline as excess fat doesn't contribute much to protein needs. A tolerable upper intake limit for proteins has not been set, but it is recommended that you do not exceed the upper end of the AMDR. Remember, our bodies recycle amino acids, which is why the needs for protein are not as high as what people think. Now, for certain individuals, the RDA is higher to support increased metabolic processes. Growing children, adolescents, women who are pregnant, lactating women, and athletes are all at a higher need for protein. The International Society of Sports Nutrition recommends for building muscle mass and for maintaining muscle mass through positive muscle protein balance, an overall daily protein intake in the range of 1.4 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day is sufficient for most exercising individuals. Higher intakes may be needed for short periods during intensified training or with reduced energy intake. Spacing of protein intake is also a factor, as recommendations from the ISSN are generally to aim for 0.25 grams per kilogram of body weight or 20 to 40 grams per serving and space intake over 3 to 4 hours. The appropriate amount of protein in a person's diet is that which maintains a balance between what is taken in and what is used. The RDAs for protein were determined by assessing nitrogen balance. A person is said to be in nitrogen balance when the nitrogen consumed equals the amount of nitrogen excreted. With negative nitrogen balance, a person's excreted nitrogen is higher than consumed, which means more protein is breaking down than consumed. This can be the result of conditions like cancer or severely low protein diets. With positive nitrogen balance, less nitrogen is excreted than what is consumed. The body is using this excess protein to synthesize new tissues. This can be the case during pregnancy or if healing from a severe burn. Although severe protein deficiency is rare in the developed world, it is a leading cause of death in children in many poor underdeveloped countries. Protein energy undernutrition, or PEU, which was formerly called protein energy malnutrition, or PEM, is related to a group of disorders that includes marasmus, kwashiorkor, and the intermediate state. PEU can be sudden or gradual, with severity ranging from subclinical deficiencies to wasting to starvation. Both PEU conditions increase infection risk. Marasmus includes weight loss and depletion of fat and muscle. Growth would be slowed, and there is more of a skin and bones appearance. Kwashiorkor is where the cell membranes leak, which causes peripheral edema. There is also dry and thin skin, enlarged liver, and ascites. Kwashiorkor can be the result of severe protein deficiency or acute illnesses like gastroenteritis. Treatment would include correcting fluid and electrolytes with IV solutions and then replenishing nutrients. Total starvation is fatal in 8 to 12 weeks. While there isn't technically an upper limit to protein, there are some concerns with excessive intake. The first concern relates to the source. High animal protein intake, specifically with red meat and processed meats, can increase cholesterol and saturated fat intake, leading to an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Also, if protein dominates the plate, making sure other nutrients are not displaced would be key. Previously, it was thought that protein would lead to osteoporosis, as elevated intakes can increase calcium excretion. This is not really a concern, as protein intake can increase intestinal calcium absorption. With chronic kidney disease, while excessive intake of protein doesn't necessarily cause CKD, protein does need to be restricted once diagnosed. This would depend on the staging of CKD and kidney function and should be calculated with a registered dietitian. Part of the reasoning is that excessive protein strains the kidneys as they need to filter and excrete nitrogen as urea. The urea cycle is the body's way of converting toxic ammonia into urea. Ammonia originates from protein catabolism. Another concern could be relating to dehydration risk. Since fluid is needed to filter and excrete nitrogen, this can increase fluid needs. While inadequate fluid can certainly increase dehydration risk, research has not shown higher protein intakes to significantly affect water balance. Let's review vegetarian diets. There are many different types of vegetarian diets. Broadly, a vegetarian would exclude meat from their diet. However, someone could be flexitarian and eat meat sporadically, or pescatarian, where they avoid meat but eat fish and seafood. Someone who is lacto-ovo-vegetarian would avoid meat but consume eggs and dairy. Lastly, someone who is vegan would not consume any animal products. Raw vegan is a subset of vegan, which is when an individual consumes fruits, vegetables, nuts and seeds, legumes, and sprouted grains. The amount of uncooked food varies from 75% to 100%. There are many benefits to a plant-based diet. Research from the IOP conference series, Earth and Environmental Science, found because of the higher intake of vegetables, grains, fruits, nuts, and fiber from a vegetarian diet, and lower intake of saturated fat and cholesterol, a vegetarian diet has health benefits in lowering the risk of getting chronic diseases like obesity, cardiovascular disease, and maybe even cancer. The journal Advances in Nutrition also recommend plant-based diets to improve nutritional adequacy and reduce the development of chronic conditions such as obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, and select cancers like endometrial, colorectal, and breast cancers. While plant-based diets can be quite beneficial to health, there are some nutrients of concern, especially for a vegan diet. Protein is often highlighted as a concern. However, vegetarians, including vegans, the diets typically meet or exceed recommended protein intakes when caloric intakes are adequate. Remember, protein from a variety of plants would be important to supply the essential amino acids, and pairing proteins is not necessary. Iron can be a concern for a plant-based diet, and this can be due to non-heme iron intake from plants. One way to increase iron status is to consume vitamin C, which enhances iron absorption. Examples of iron-rich foods include green leafy vegetables and beans. Zinc is another nutrient of concern, though overt deficiency is not evident in the U.S. Zinc sources for the vegetarian include soy products, legumes, grains, cheese, nuts, and seeds. Iodine can be a concern if vegans are not utilizing iodized salt or sea vegetables. Calcium intake with vegetarians may not be a concern with dairy, however with vegans it can be. Good calcium sources include kale, bok choy, calcium-set tofu, and plant milks. Vitamin D is a concern for most individuals, and status depends on sunlight exposure and intake of vitamin D fortified foods or supplements. Dietary sources can include fortified non-dairy milks and breakfast cereals. Lastly, vitamin B12 is not a component of plant foods. Vegans must regularly consume reliable sources, meaning B12 fortified foods or B12 containing supplements, or they could become deficient. Here is a picture of what the vegan My Plate can look like from the Vegetarian Resource Group. A quarter of the plate is protein, a quarter greens, a little more than a quarter is vegetables, and a little less than a quarter will be fruits. The dairy is also replaced by calcium with an emphasis on leafy greens, calcium fortified soy milk, and tofu. B12 is also noted as this is necessary for vegans to consume a reliable source of.